what you've got to take into account, my perspective is really something that comes to my head through a collective memory in a split moment, and I just spit it out. Some things are back to front, etc. as far as a certain perspective on in a world that has really nothing that new to offer. Let me ask you something. Have a think about it very clearly for a moment. What is the most prizeworthy commodity that we have? Drinkable water. You realize fundamentally the amount of oil there is in this world produced, I'm not talking about refined, is such an overpriced commodity regardless of the fluctuation of currencies and what fundamental, they only exist on the velocity that's around them. And these crises that are appearing right in front of us, coincidental timing, it's no coincidence, is so protected by crises because the amount of energy you need to contain a crisis, any crisis is more than what you're generating out of it, where it's supported by the media on every count, good guy, bad guy, etc. I'm not even going to be having to share any detail. There's so much analysis on this. But remember the story. Look up Kuwait. Here it is. In the 1960s, 70s, up until about 1980. Then have a look at the gold price at that time. Have a look at the changes. And have a look at where Abu Dhabi, Qatar, Dubai were at the time. I mean, they were basically tiny little ports. You see, things change and then they just evaporate the moment a certain economy peaks. Look, there was an analysis performed somewhere in the 80s and 90s, could have been even as late as mid-70s, but it was actually after what we had as an oil crisis in the early 70s, etc. But supposed oil crisis. And the analysis was the following. It could actually do an equation where the amount of oil that's taken from the ground to how much oil we got left to the consumption we're going to project. What it all means is that we could work out what would be the maximum capacity of oil where the earth that could be generated from under the ground from planet Earth with various methods, whether it's shale drilling, whether it's oil in desert, whatever the case may be. But the reality of it is that many years have passed since then, say about 40 years, and you've got to ask yourself, when you work out the amount of reserves there are globally, have people lost their plot to think that we are relying on some 25% of oil that comes out of a certain part of the region of the world? I'm not talking about refineries, and etc., etc. First of all, most of the world's consumption when it comes to actual crude is for heavier machinery, whether it's tankers, whether it's planes, whether it's military, etc., etc. What I can't understand, for 1,000,000th time that's repeated on mainstream media, is phrases such as reserves, a panic, etc., etc. Now, look, at the end of the day, I don't do geopolitical videos. Generally, I love geopolitics and the way various systems around the world operate, but I avoid them, and I avoid my opinion for on a certain broader take, simply because I don't want to be in a situation where remotely am labelled as some conspiracy theorist where, coincidental way of looking at the world that, there's free trade and everything operates along a route and supply and demand, etc. I don't need to comment any further. But what I will say is that when you work out the timing on a commodity such as oil, that with all the other aspects and motives that we've had to move to other sources, you've got to ask yourself the amount of patents there are. There is ways of doing research with this, whether you want to use AI, classic Google run-throughs, whatever, things you'll find, things you won't find. There's a whole lot of aspects you won't find in any kind of written literature or even using AI, right? You don't need to know a statistic to imagine the amount of energy there is to replace a whole heap of energy that we've so-called, getting away from, such as oil. Yet it seems to be a situation we seem to have a situation where a simple 10-20% price hike was expected due to one reason or another. I mean, get the timing, February 2022. February 2020. Yeah, like the peak of world pandemic, February 2026 now. March, I don't even have to predict, whether it's going to go to April or in and out, quieter time during Northern Hemisphere, summer break, etc. That's irrelative. It's a major shockwave where, as far as what they call inflation is concerned, yeah? Just don't forget two important things to take into account. To understand a broader picture of where we are today, you can go back to the Athenian-Spartan War, 600 BC. You can go back to the time of the old Venetian cultures and Rome, the burning of Alexandria, library, 2nd or 3rd century. But there was a book, hard to track. I've got the book, I just don't have the time to actually locate it, but it's called The World of 1815. And it's actually a book that really is revolved around a world at the time, over 200 years ago, that really emphasises a whole heap of laws that, in the Napoleonic era were created he had a lot to do with, but the system is so broadly connected that global trade in a way was very predominant then. It's just that the global trade was predominantly in Europe. I mean, you had so many kingdoms. You had Austria-Hungary Empire, you had Russia, England, France, major France that had a proportion of the old German states under, working as allies, and then you had the opposites. Ottoman Empire was still around. Even Portugal and Spain had a little bit of still enough of an influence. Basically, what I'm trying to explain is that you've got to ask yourself, like there was a professional battlefield back then every 3 to 6 weeks. Who and how, where did these uniforms come from? If you just see the uniforms from that era, you would ask yourself, who funds this? Forget about the stories of the Rothschilds. That's what we know. That's just the icing on the cake. What I can't understand, when we look at the situation and the scenario today, or where we're at as a society, do you not understand what global trade means and why it's so vital? Because we need to have control. Who's we? I don't want to comment. I don't know. But there's a whole heap of control when your export and import levels are to be travelled all over the world. So you've got a constant Luna Park, so to speak. okay, where peaks and troughs are there. The dynamics are a lot more than a classical concerto, I'll tell you that now, because we've had a fairly quiet period over the last few months. Let's you know. So you've got to sort of look at this broadly and understand the moment you see this in every headline, you've got to ask yourself what's behind it. Because oil as a commodity is just one aspect. There's so many other aspects. They talk about chips, they talk about food, because there's no food in the Middle East, there's no drinkable water. What do we do? There's only one shipping lane, etc., etc. By the way, 3/4 of the planet covered in water, oceans, yeah? Oil everywhere. The most overpriced asset, I'm not including the cost to generate it, to refine it, that's probably worth fundamentally $5 a barrel, whatever a dollar is today fundamentally. I don't want to get into further economics, etc. Recall the time, March 2020, at the beginning of a pandemic, epidemic, whatever you want to call it, okay? Barrel of oil was fundamentally about $27 to $30. $27 to $30 a litre. Get it? So, you know, you've got players like Ursula von der Leyen that insisted that all the refineries and all the liquefied energy gas, half it has to come from Qatar. But you cannot buy the Russian oil, and there's issues because they're going to take over, there's going to be a big war, they're going to take the whole of Europe, and see how, I don't know, will that happen? I don't know, I'm not going to make any judgment. But see how some of the dots are very relative in today's situation, and people are still walking around with their phones dumbfounded. There's actual footages in Australian media where certain service stations, petrol stations in remote country towns of South Australia, right, don't have any fuel. Shortage of fuel in Australia. Like, Australia holds about 6 or 7% of LNG, liquefied energy gas. You've got to ask yourself, how? How does this happen? I'm sure there's mistakes that we all make, and even the highest parliamentary levels, but this is what happens. This is a part of the picture, right, that gets served. The least commodity that's in danger is an overflow of supply. All these countries involved, they're all oil producers. All of them. So-called oil producers. The League of Nations got together in 1920 and formed the first type of 1920. The first type of, that was before United Nations, the first type of visas, so to speak. There was passports back in the 2nd century in the Han or Min dynasty in ancient China. In the 2nd or 3rd century, there was formal, very simplistic passports. It wasn't a question of, but in 1920, read up on the League of Nations and some of the changes that occurred just after World War I. What I'm getting at is that there's no shortage of anything. That's just my take. But unfortunately, due to the fact that we're living in times of headline versus fundamental understanding, headlines more important than fundamental understanding. Press run by two entities, generally Associated Press or Reuters, and then you've got the other extreme of the presses from, let's just say, parts of the world that are totally so-called opposite to Reuters and Associated Press. None of the extremes actually have any reality because everything is intertwined. Okay, if we stop consuming for 1 week as a planetary system, the whole system would fail. There's too much of everything. World is not overpopulated, but it's certainly overpopulated in cities that, I think that the whole planet would be able to physically fit in something the size of Texas. There was a model. Of course, we're overpopulating the cities. I mean, general sewer systems in most cities, it's, I actually did so many topics on this, but it amazes me that through the mainstream media, we have constant repetitions that just resolve to one thing, and that's just a constant robbery of the middle class that won't exist at all. So I then ask for you to summarize and wrap up. Imagine the amount of damage that will be caused to the whole industry with the troughs of ups and downs, parties involved, the markets, if the escalation of these type of conflicts was not spread out in a certain way. Certain diversion, certain troughs and peaks, and then coincidentally revert back to February 2020, February 2022, February 2026. So now at least we've got a crisis. We've got Channel 7 reports on flights that are diverted but with only limited passengers on board. You know, just have a think about the collective damage that would be caused if the actual conflicts were only limited to a small portion of territory and exposure. A commodity price there's more oil in the world 20-fold conservatively than what the fundamental prices are. But just have a think about it. Crude, of course, there is a cost in refining. There's all sorts of crude. But anyway, just have a think about it for a moment.